Alright, so lately, and by lately I mean the past 4, 5, 6, 7 years or so, there's been a lot of controversy, a lot of confusion around the DC cinematic universe and what it means, what it is, what the movies in it are. Firstly, you might be wondering, what is the Snyderverse? Well, if you're watching this, you probably already know, but just for the sake of clarity and organization, I'm going to briefly describe it anyway. In short, the Snyderverse includes, but is not necessarily limited to, Zack Snyder's vision for the DC universe on film. Some of these films that are part of the Snyderverse include Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, Suicide Squad 2016, Wonder Woman, and Zack Snyder's Justice League. The Snyderverse was officially ended with the film Justice League, and there was a lot of hoopla involved in that film that involved Joss Whedon and Zack Snyder having to step away from the production of the film due to a family tragedy, but also due to Warner Brothers executives not really wanting him to be part of the film anymore. As everybody knows, Joss Whedon's Justice League was like a massive commercial and critical failure, and a couple years later, in 2021, Zack Snyder got a chance to release his own version of the film, Zack Snyder's Justice League. Now, of course, this wasn't the true original, and there were a lot of tweaks in it, but generally it was considered to be a huge improvement on Joss Whedon's theatrical version of the film. That, of course, didn't make any money being released on HBO Max, but received generally pretty favorable reviews, and me personally, I think it was pretty decent. There's some weird stuff in it, it's too long, but overall, yeah, it's a real movie. I'll give it a watch, I'll give it a thumbs up, I'll give it the Book and Movie Guy's stamp of approval, I'll give it the whatever, I don't know. At this point, I have to admit that things are going to get a little bit awkward, because this is the part where I should start really defining more specifically what the Snyderverse is. But despite building the intro of this video on the definition of the Snyderverse, I have to frankly admit to you that if there were a gun to my head, I could not tell you what the Snyderverse is. I simply could not. So after a huge campaign to release the Snyder Cut was released, some other things happened, and as of February 2023, James Gunn has been brought on board to sort of right the ship of the DC Cinematic Universe, or Extended Universe, or whatever it's called these days, and bring it in a new direction. Zack Snyder has stepped away from DC, he's making stuff for Netflix, Rebel Moon, Army of the Dead, whatever, and that's pretty much the end of things. Right? Right? Turns out that's actually not right, and things are a lot more complicated than that. If you search what movies are part of the Snyderverse, you'll get a lot of different sites with a lot of different and varied results. For instance, on superheromovies.com, which is a very reputable source, fact-checked by Norman Hamsters, the only movies that are listed on there as part of the Snyderverse are the 3 Zack Snyder directed films: Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and Zack Snyder's Justice League. It does not list Wonder Woman or Suicide Squad 2016. However, the films that IMDb lists include the Zack Snyder films, as well as some non-Zack Snyder films and films that were never actually even released, as well as some that have not come out yet, including Blue Beetle, The Flash, Shazam! Fear of the Gods, Black Adam, Peacemaker, The Suicide Squad, Zack Snyder's Justice League, Birds of Prey, Aquaman, Shazam, Wonder Woman, Suicide Squad, Batman v Superman, and Man of Steel. It's kind of odd that this list includes things that Zack Snyder had nothing to do with, and includes a lot of unreleased films like Deadshot and Jared Leto Joker movie, which are probably not ever happening. But whatever, IMDb is weird, frequently makes mistakes, can be again edited by a hamster, or who knows whatever. So let's check out another source, like maybe Zack Snyder himself, and see what the old Snyder man has to say.
I'm like, wake the fuck up!
So during an interview with Inverse, Zack Snyder was specifically asked what he defines the Snyderverse as, and I'm just going to read you the question and his response. At this point, do you consider the Snyderverse to be the DC movies, or this Army of the Dead universe that you're developing now? To which Zack Snyder answered, I would hope that anything Snyderversian is whatever we're doing as original IP. The DC universe is something that's very close to my heart, and something I spent a lot of time developing and thinking about, so I love it. But where I am right now is with the Rebel Moon of it all, and the Army of the Dead of it all. They're very much consuming our creative output. Hopefully, just anything that we're doing that's original and cool would fit into that category. So to be fair, this is not a very direct answer about the Snyderverse as it relates to DC, but it's a question about the Snyderverse in general. And while it is a distinction, I still think it is an interesting and relevant distinction. Zack Snyder is basically saying that he doesn't care. He's moved on from these DC things, from the DC Snyderverse or whatever. Of course, he is a man who likes to play games, and this could be part of that game, but it seems fairly earnest to me, and I think it is definitely the case that he's more interested in the projects that he's working on now instead of the projects he was working on years ago that gave him so much grief and trauma. So with that in mind, Zack Snyder doesn't really see his DC movies as like the definitive DC or Snyderverse. To Snyder, DC is not the Snyderverse. There's not a Snyderverse to restore. The Snyderverse is just whatever he's working on at the time. So does that mean we have to exclude Zack's opinion, exclude Zack from the movement because he doesn't consider the movement to be something that's actually connected to him or to his work? Snyder fans would of course say, no, we must include what Zack Snyder says because he is the daddy, he is the Mohammed, the Jesus, he knows all. But this again brings us back to kind of the original question. Is the Snyderverse just Snyder-directed films, or are they films that are built around Snyder's films and films in which Snyder had his paws on? Just as there was a big push to hashtag release the Snyder Cut, there has recently been a really big push to hashtag release the Ayer Cut. The Ayer Cut being the original version of Suicide Squad 2016. Many people consider Suicide Squad to be a part of the Snyderverse. However, are we considering the theatrical version of Suicide Squad to be part of the Snyderverse or the David Ayer cut? Again, there's mass confusion on this as there seems to be no large consensus on which version of Suicide Squad we like or don't like. However, trying to make things simple and consider the Snyderverse as a whole, I would personally definitely include the theatrical 2016 Suicide Squad and 2017 Wonder Woman films as part of that universe, as part of that Snyderverse, because they're both released prior to Zack Snyder being removed from the 2017 version of Justice League and being replaced by Joss Whedon. However, after those two films is when things start to get a little bit tricky. Basically, to me, we need to break the timeline into two parts. Pre-Whedon and post-Whedon. Definitively, I would say that anything pre-Whedon is obviously Snyder Cut, because it's something that was released when Zack Snyder was still, I guess, the architect or in charge of the DC Extended Cinematic Movie Universe, whatever, at that time. Anything post-Whedon is obviously a lot more hazy because Snyder was no longer involved, and frankly, we don't really know who was calling the shots. Maybe Kevin Tsujihara, maybe Jeff Johns. I'm not going to get into every single DC movie and how it does or does not technically connect to the official Snyderverse or Justice League or whatever. I just want to do that with one movie, and only a little bit. And that movie is James Wan's film, Aquaman.
Could have just peed on it.
I bring up Aquaman because it is largely Snyderversian. Snyder has a producing credit on it. It includes a ton of characters cast by Zack Snyder. It builds on plot points from Zack Snyder's previous films and some of Justice League. However, it's complicated because it was released post-Whedon, and it is canon to the theatrical 2017 Whedon version of Justice League and not Zack Snyder's Justice League. This has been stated both by Warner Brothers executives and I think James Gunn and Snyder himself. There are also very minor bits of dialogue that reference the 2017 film or fit better to the 2017 film than they do to the Zack Snyder version of Justice League. But again, I don't want to split hairs and focus on those little details. If you're interested, there's lots of Reddit posts and comment threads out there about this very topic. I bring this up because it raises a lot of really interesting questions as to what actually is canon and who can define what canon is, especially in a large, complicated film universe like this. Should canon be defined by the people making the movies? Should James Wan be able to say what is or is not canon to Aquaman? Should Zack Snyder be the one to say what is or is not canon to his movies? It's a very big, confusing mess, and defining canon in this sense is, I think, even more complicated than figuring out what is canon to, say, comic books. Because the world of film and how people are exposed to it is so complicated. Generally, I would say that canon is what audiences are most exposed to, because most audience members don't know or understand what it means when a director or a vague studio executive says something is or is not canon. If they've seen it and they remember it, it's canon. Is that the most academic or cinematic or literary way to view it? No, but that's the world we live in, and because I can't give a real answer, I think that's more so supporting my point that these arguments about what is or is not canon are very difficult and useless, and yet are extremely relevant to defining what the Snyderverse is and how one could or could not try to restore it. With With all that said, the easiest way for me personally to figure out what the Snyderverse is, was, or supposed to be is to look at the slate of films DC had announced back in 2014 when the only film audiences had seen was Man of Steel. And most people weren't pissed off yet. A lot were just kind of like, or like, and weren't actively hostile or memeing quite to the scope and scale they were after Batman v Superman came out. So for some context, at a shareholder meeting in October of 2014, Warner Brothers announced a slew of DC films that were going to be coming out, building upon Man of Steel, and kind of with like Zack Snyder, at least Zack Snyder's movies at the center. Again, I'm gonna look to my trusty old device here and read you a list of what those films were. The first in the slate was Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, to be released in 2016, Suicide Squad, to be released in 2016, a Wonder Woman film starring Gal Gadot, to be released in 2017, Justice League Part 1, directed by Zack Snyder, releasing in 2017, The Flash starring Ezra Miller, to be released in 2018, Aquaman starring Jason Momoa, to be released in 2018, a Shazam film to be released in 2019, Justice League Part 2, directed by Zack Snyder, to be released in 2019, and Cyborg starring Ray Fisher, to be released in 2020, followed by a Green Lantern film, also being released in 2020. This slate remained pretty unchanged for, I don't know, like 2 years. The biggest changes were some other additions, like a Ben Affleck solo Batman film he's also supposed to write and direct. Those announced by Kevin Tsujihara in 2016 at Comic-Con. Other things that maybe we're going to get, like included a Jared Leto Joker film.
Blah, 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 blah. All of that chit-chat's gonna get you hurt.
Oh my God.
A Gotham City Sirens movie, a Man of Steel sequel, Black Adam somehow at some point, a Deadshot solo film. Most of these never actually happened, and instead you get things like Birds of Prey that build on some of these weird Suicide Squad spin-off ideas, and then like the Matt Reeves Batman, which after a very long series of events is what that Ben Affleck Batman movie ended up as. So most of these things that were announced prior or after the original 2014 slate never came to be. And about half of that 2014 slate never happened, or happened in a very different way than was originally planned. But honestly, if we're just gonna get right down to what the book and movie guy thinks, I don't think there was ever a grand blueprint or plan. Like, I don't really see Zack Snyder and executives and other writers like Jeff Johns or whoever sitting around and coming up with a very detailed plan for all these films like Kevin Feige or Marvel does or did or whatever. I really think that Warner Brothers just picked a bunch of shit that was popular in the comics and like threw it at the wall to see what would stick, and they kind of like put Zack Snyder's name on it, sort of, or like fans did. And then when Batman v Superman came out and everybody hated it, Warner Brothers like freaked the fuck out and like canceled everything and decided to throw more shit at the wall and like try to scrape shit off the wall. So all they had was like a big shitty mess that was also filled with wallpaper that like the weird guy from HR like tried to eat or something, and then in a fit of rage like they kicked him and he threw up in it. And that's kind of what they ended up with as their slate of movies, like a bunch of nasty, shitty nonsense. And Zack Snyder kind of got blamed for it because like it was kind of his fault, but also I think maybe audiences just weren't quite, I don't want to say prepared, but they definitely just weren't on board with what he was trying to do at the time, but have since sort of looked back more fondly and realized that yeah, that was okay, but mainly because like the shitty mess has been sort of cleaned up and we won't have to smell or look at it anymore, and that weird HR guy who got kicked and like threw up is gone, like he's in a homeless encampment, so we don't really need to worry about it anymore, so it doesn't seem quite as bad. I just really remember that at the time BVS dropped, like myself and everyone else was pissed off because it felt like a very rushed, botched attempt to build a cinematic universe. And that's because it was. I mean, obviously, like, I will never forget the fucking, like, JPEG files, like, the iMovie clips Wonder Woman watches of Aquaman, Cyborg, and The Flash. And this is supposed to be, like, the build-up of these characters, I guess. There's, like, too much shit in that movie, like, setting up future events or whatever. And compared to, like, Marvel and stuff at the time, like, this isn't what anybody wanted. I remember sitting around, like, talking to my pals about how stupid it was they squandered this, or like how they could have built these characters up differently or whatever, and like standing in the shower and like orchestrating my own DC cinematic universe in my mind, and like focusing on the story it didn't tell instead of focusing on the story that it like did try to tell, which as like a grown-up now who, I don't know, sort of understands these things a little bit more, I recognize was not good criticism. And again, I've reappraised Batman v Superman not as something setting up a future universe, but as like a very specific piece in a very specific puzzle. And when looked at that way, it's a lot more palatable and a lot less disappointing. What I also find interesting is how a lot of these like DC and Snyder fans are pretending like Batman v Superman and Suicide Squad were released to like critical acclaim in 2016 when they weren't. Like everybody and their grandma like fucking hated these movies, especially Suicide Squad, which I have watched since several times, and that movie is still dog shit. It still sucks. Like it's awful. It's an unwatchable film. I read the excerpts of Ayer's script, and they're not promising, but I would like still love to see that guy's original movie. Like I think he's talented. Fury is an awesome film, but Suicide Squad is like a disaster of a movie, and to pretend that it's awesome is lame. And like when Suicide Squad tanked critically, people were like wanting to boycott Rotten Tomatoes and stuff because it was like a hidden masterpiece. Same with BVS. But now, like, oh no, like Suicide Squad 2016 sucked, massacre, we always hated it. Give us the true version Ayer cut, when that's not, I mean, really the case. Again, same with Batman v Superman. Like, to pretend that people loved this movie all along is simply not true. Like, when it came out, I didn't like it. I didn't like that movie. Now I think it's fine. And a lot of people are looking back with rose-tinted glasses, pretending that we all liked it when it came out, when we didn't, because it didn't build a cinematic universe in the way we wanted. I bring this up because after the release of Zack Snyder's Justice League, and after listening to so many interviews and sound bites of him and Chris Terrio and whoever, I realized that Zack Snyder wasn't really trying to, or at least didn't really want to build a cinematic universe. Like, yes, in Justice League, there is weird setup for future things like Atom and Martian Manhunter and the whole, like, 6 chairs with room for more scene and whatnot, but if I'm looking at the bigger picture, I feel like Snyder's vision is a lot more narrow and limited, and he was really interested in telling like a story at the beginning and a middle and an end. Like, he had a 5-film plan that involved Superman and Batman in one room in the Justice League, as in the 2 or 3 Justice League films or whatever, BVS and Man of Steel, and like that was it for him. He had a very specific and clear goal of like telling the story of this universe in 5 movies. And well, yes, things like Suicide Squad and Wonder Woman are connected. They're not connected in the same way these Marvel films are, where they're like steps leading up to the finale. They're like side quests, they're like bonus content, and Zack Snyder's 4 or 5 films are really the main point. Like, he had a specific story he was telling about Superman, clearly, and he didn't really care about setting up a bunch of other things or exploring it or making this story take as much time as it needed. He just wanted to tell it and be done. He was approaching this as like somebody who writes a graphic novel would, like it's an insulated part of a wider universe, you can just do whatever you want, instead of like a crossover event, which is what a lot of audiences and fans were looking for. And I think that really backfired and destroyed their cinematic universe, because it turns out the guy in charge wasn't really trying to build a cinematic universe. And this isn't to say that like Zack Snyder's films are like specific pieces of like artistic integrity where like, he was trying to tell this limited, grounded avant-garde story like the Godfather trilogy or something, because obviously he wasn't. Again, there's still a bunch of weird, goofy shit crammed into these movies, but I do think that he was a lot more focused than you would think now, that like the DC Cinematic Universe is now, or that like the MCU is now, and it was a lot more grounded. And again, his artistic vision, I'm not saying that artistic vision is like good or perfectly authentic or 100% high quality, but I do think, again, it was a narrow vision that you don't generally get in these big superhero franchises anymore, and that is obviously not very good grounds for building a wider universe on. It's pretty like myopic, whatever. And obviously that's not what works when you're trying to build out 1,000 different movies. And looking back at that now, I have to ask myself, were we wrong in 2016? Would I love to see Snyder come back and finish up this trilogy or like pen trilogy or whatever? Yeah, absolutely. I think that'd be awesome. However, like, that's not gonna happen. We need to wake up, fans need to realize that there are other things going on and move on. the Snyderverse is not going to be and cannot be restored. The reason for this, as I hope I proved, is because there was never really a Snyderverse in the first place. There's not a plan or a blueprint to restore. There was, at best, like a patchwork quilt of ideas that were held together with very, very thin thread. I know there's all this talk about like selling the Snyderverse to Netflix to restore it, and like those weird like deepfake AI videos or whatever people are doing, and I'm like, just stop. Just stop, please. The Snyderverse is not going to Netflix, like, ever. I mean, it might, anything can happen. DC is weird, and the news changes every day, but professionally, it's probably not gonna happen, and that's fine. Like, we need to move on. And yes, I know we've been here before, saying that something Snyder-related doesn't exist, only to find out that it did, and get it, but that was different, because that was one specific film that, to me, had definitive proof of existence. Like, we saw pictures of it, we saw the reels. And yes, it needed to be finished, obviously. Anyone who understood how films are made knew that. The point is, there was something there, like tangible, that could be completed and released. With the Snyderverse, that's not the case. We're grasping at a very abstract idea, an abstract plan that was like a rough draft at best. There is nothing tangible to restore. There is no grand Zack Snyder Snyderverse plan to restore. And for that reason, this is not like the release the Snyder Cut campaign. It isn't. I'm sorry. With all that said, I should mention the timing of this video. The Flash comes out in a couple months. The DC universe is constantly evolving. The hierarchy of power in the DC universe has changed. Literally anything can happen at any time. The Flash could come out and restore the Snyderverse. It probably won't. It's probably going to like negate it forever. James Gunn seems pretty insistent on moving away. There is the weird business with Henry Cavill and Black Adam and Batgirl and whatever, and things are a huge dumpster fire right now, and everything is changing. But honestly, that's been the case for these movies the past 10 years. There has never been a stable foundation for us to build these expectations on, and we need to stop. With that in mind, I am like interested and kind of optimistic about some of the stuff James Gunn has planned, specifically like Booster Gold. Of course, I'm sad Henry Cavill's gone, but I don't want to like fanboy or nerd out or like be weird about this. Like, their movies, they're gonna come out, I'm gonna watch them, and I'll talk about them once they're out, or I won't. Like, I don't like to speculate or to guess or make predictions, because that's how your content very quickly becomes irrelevant and how you look stupid. This is just an interesting topic that's been on my mind a lot lately, and I wanted to provide some perspective in defining what these terms actually mean, because that's not something anyone in any of these forums or movements seem actually interested in doing. So, to make a long story short, I don't know what the future holds for DC. But really, I don't know what the past held for DC either. The only thing constant about this universe is that it's always changing. And really, I think the best thing that we can do is like get out of our mom's basements and watch movies that aren't like fucking theme park rides all the time.